Hi guys, welcome to another episode of U.S. History with Lennox, and today we're going to be discussing one of the final compromises made in the U.S. leading up to the U.S. Civil War. Today we're going to talk about the Compromise of 1850. Now the Compromise of 1850 is a result of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. If you remember correctly, the Mexican-American War is going to end with America gaining a lot of Western territory. And just like earlier times, the question becomes, what happens as we expand into that territory? And more importantly, what about slavery? Should it be allowed or should it not be allowed? And that's what the Compromise of 1850 is going to address. Now, Congress is going to try to be proactive during the war with regards to this question. David Wilmot from Pennsylvania is going to introduce what's known as the Wilmot Proviso. And the Wilmot Proviso basically said that any territory that we gained from Mexico would be free. There would be no slavery allowed. Now, this is not going to pass, and part of it could be the way he tried to get it passed. He attached the proviso to a War Appropriations Bill. And an Appropriations Bill is basically a bill that funds the military during the war. And he tried to kind of attach that as an amendment. It will pass the House of Representatives, but when it gets to the Senate, Southern states are going to be angry because they see this as a conspiracy against their economic base. It's not going to pass the Senate. And besides, ticking off Southern states, it's also going to split the Northern Democrats, those who supported slavery in new territories and those who were against it. This is going to spur also what's known as the Free Soil Movement. In America at this point, you had a competition between the free labor of the North, those men who worked for wages, and the slave labor of the South. The issue of slavery expanding into the territories was seen as a threat to the free labor movement, because the more slavery that existed in our country, the less wage-earning jobs that would be available. So a lot of people started going against the expansion of slavery. And that's how the Free Soil Party is going to get its start in 1848. Their motto was free soil, free labor, free men. They believed that the Western territories, these new territories that we gained from the Mexican-American War, should be kept open as an opportunity for white men. And it's not that they were against slavery. They were just against slavery spreading. Now, Southerners see this as an attempt to restrict slavery, which they viewed as a threat to their constitutional rights. In fact, they believed that stopping the spread of slavery was a violation of the Constitution. And that's going to be the basis of their argument going forward. The election of 1848 is going to be centered around this debate. Now, interestingly, Zachary Taylor, who's going to be the candidate for the Whigs, took no position on slavery. He was a slave owner, yet he didn't believe in the expansion of slavery. The Democrat on the ticket, Lewis Cass, he and the Democrats are going to support popular sovereignty. Let the people in the territories determine whether or not they would allow slavery. And a third-party candidate, the Free Soiler candidate, Martin Van Buren, the same Martin Van Buren who was vice president to Andrew Jackson and served his own term as president, is going to be running on the idea against the expansion of slavery. Taylor wins, and he'll become the 12th president of the United States. Now, one reason that's going to help him win is the fact that he was a hero of the Mexican-American War. He was from the state of Louisiana, and his nickname is Old Rough and Ready. Unfortunately, though, he is going to die in office. He'll serve about 1 year, and he will actually die. There was actually this big mystery about how he died. There was a theory that he had actually been poisoned. Now, that had been proven false years later, but it made for a great story. Another little piece of trivia about Zachary Taylor: he will be the last Southerner elected to the office of the presidency until 1912, and that will be Woodrow Wilson when he gets elected. Now, when he dies, his vice president, Millard Fillmore, will take office. Now, he was also a Whig, but from the state of New York. Now, he is going to actually sign the Compromise of 1850 that we're going to be talking about in this lecture today. He will be the last Whig president. Now, what's very interesting is one reason why there was this thought that Zachary Taylor had been poisoned was the fact that many believed that he would not sign a compromise such as the Compromise of 1850, and that could have led to his demise. Again, this was proven false later, but maybe they missed something. If you didn't have enough controversy with how we should expand into the West, gold is discovered in 1849, and this is just going to increase the tension between the sections of our country. California is going to want to come into the United States right away. Remember, they had been the Bear Flag Republic, and then once the war was over, they started moving towards statehood. They actually wrote a state constitution that banned slavery and asked for immediate admission into the Union. The problem at this point in history is we had an equal balance of slave states and free states in the U.S. Senate. And so what do you do? And the Southerners, as we're moving more and more into the 1850s, you're going to find that they're becoming more and more defensive about slavery. It seems like every time we get more land, new legislation comes up that's trying to either stop slavery or stop the expansion of slavery. Think about it. The Talmadge Amendment in 1819, then the Wilmot Proviso just in the last few months. And then you're going to see the rise of the Underground Railroad. The Southerners are really starting to feel that there is this push against them to completely end slavery and take away their way of life. And so they become more and more defensive about it. You're even going to have some radical, quote, fire eaters, that was their nickname, fire eaters, who were actually openly talking about secession in 1849, 11 years before South Carolina secedes. You can kind of feel the tension starting to increase in our country over this question of the expansion of slavery. So the question becomes, what do we do? How do we handle this problem? The Wilmot Proviso didn't go through. We have Southern fire eaters threatening to secede. Do we have just one more compromise in us? And the answer is yes, we do. And it's going to be the Compromise of 1850. The Compromise of 1850 is going to be put together by, number one, the great compromiser, Henry Clay, and number two, Stephen Douglas, a senator from the state of Illinois. Now, the Compromise of 1850 has 5 provisions to it, 5 parts, if you will. The very first part says California is going to come in as a free state. Okay. The next one says popular sovereignty is going to determine whether slavery exists in new territories or not. The settlers of those territories will decide whether or not that happens. We're also going to get some land from Texas. They're going to basically sell land to the United States in order to pay off their debt. So we're going to get a big chunk of public land, and they're going to get $10 million. No big controversy there. We're going to abolish the slave trade in Washington, D.C. Now, interestingly, Washington, D.C. is in slave territory in our country, and it wasn't uncommon to see slaves in the Capitol. What was a little bit more disheartening was when you had slave auctions in the Capitol. Remember, we have foreign dignitaries coming into the Capitol quite often, and it's just not a good look. So part of the Compromise of 1850 said, you know what, slavery in D.C. is fine. We can't stop that. But we want to basically regulate where slave auctions will and won't take place. And so we're not going to allow the slave trade to take place within the boundaries of our nation's capital. And the fifth and final part of the Compromise of 1850 is probably the most controversial. And that's going to be a stronger fugitive slave law. Now, we have had fugitive slave laws on the books since 1793. And I believe some states even had them earlier than that. But fugitive slave laws basically protect slave owners when their slaves escape. It allows them to recapture them and bring them back. Well, this one that's added into the Compromise of 1850 is a lot stronger, and it puts a lot more of the federal authority behind it. Basically, it's going to create this huge increase in sectional tension. Because what it's going to do is basically turn the North into a hunting ground for fugitive slaves. Bounty hunters from the South will be able to travel freely through northern states seeking out escaped slaves or even freemen who they are accusing of being escaped slaves. If you are a northerner caught assisting a runaway slave, you could be held liable and you yourself could end up in jail. And on top of this, slaves that are captured have no standing in court. They get no jury trials to prove that they are actually a freeman versus an escaped slave. So what does this mean? Basically, if you think about it, a, quote, slave bounty hunter could travel throughout the North, and if they found any African American, free or escaped, they could capture him, take him into custody, and return him to the South without a trial, without anybody checking for papers or anything like that. This is, like I said, it turns the North into a hunting ground for fugitive slaves. So there's going to be a growing resistance against this. You're going to see sympathy for the abolition movement start to grow. The abolition movement, when it first got started, was seen as this radical movement kind of out on the fringe of society. Well, now that this is in place, people are going to say, hey, wait a minute, maybe they were onto something. And then you're also going to see states pass what were called personal liberty laws. These are basically state laws put in place to supersede the federal laws, meaning like in Wisconsin, they said, no, we're going to provide jury trials for these captured, fugitive slaves. And on top of that, you can't use our jails or any of our correctional facilities to hold on to these accused fugitive slaves. So the tension, like I said, is growing. So the Compromise of 1850, in a nutshell, the North, what they got to admit California as a free state. And the South, for their part, got a stronger fugitive slave law. The other three parts, well, in the newly acquired New Mexico territory, popular sovereignty would determine whether or not slavery would be permitted. And the federal government's going to assume Texas debt, and Texas is going to give the federal government more land that they can settle. And then finally, the slave trade is going to be abolished in Washington, D.C. So what we're looking at now is this is the land we had before. And then after the Compromise of 1850, this is what our map looks like. Notice the difference with Texas. You can see the land that is ceded to the federal government. But, getting this legislation passed wasn't that easy. You had the great triumvirate, the top three guys in the Senate, Daniel Webster, Henry Clay, and John C. Calhoun. They were divided on this. Webster and Clay supported the compromise. Calhoun was against it. And that was the general feeling throughout the Congress on both sides. You had northern states who supported part of it but were against part of it. Southern states supported part of it but were against other parts of it. And so people were voting on both sides of this, It wasn't like the North voted for it and the South said no. It was divided throughout the country. So Henry Clay went to work. He went to work trying to bring everyone together, and he had assistance from Stephen Douglas. Initially, the bill was set up as what we call an omnibus bill, all 5 parts of the compromise in one bill. But they couldn't get a majority to pass it. So Henry Clay is going to step in, and they are going to separate the omnibus bill, the big bill, into 5 separate bills. What this is going to allow to happen is for senators and representatives to vote on the bills they wanted and abstain from the ones that they didn't. This is going to allow all 5 parts of the compromise to be passed. Now that it's passed, man, crisis averted. Everyone's happy, right? Not really. Because even though the Compromise of 1850 did quell a lot of the tension in our country, it didn't erase it. And the tension is just going to continue to build the further we go into 1850s until eventually it explodes into the Civil War. But we'll talk about that on the next one. Appreciate you watching. Again, like always, if you have any questions, please put them down in the comments below and consider subscribing. I'd appreciate it. Other than that, We'll see you next time. Thanks again.